50,000 years of warp travel had produced a particular kind of certainty in the galactic community. The certainty that crossing the space between stars was a problem, and that the problem had been solved, and that the solution was the enormous, fuel-hungry, temperamental machinery that every spacefaring species had independently developed and then spent centuries refining. The drives worked by forcing space to accommodate a fiction, compressing the distance between 2 points until the journey between them became survivable. They required exotic materials that were difficult to refine and more difficult to store. They left gravitational signatures visible to sensors across several light years. They were the only way anyone traveled, which meant they were the only way anyone had ever thought to travel, which meant no one had looked for another way in 50,000 years. The human ships appeared at the edge of Council space without any of the signatures that should have preceded them. No energy flare, no gravitational distortion, no exotic particle trail. The Council's detection network registered their presence the way you register something that was not there, and then was, with no interval of becoming in between. The human ambassador arrived for her summons in the same manner, which did not make it less unsettling the second time. The chairman asked his question directly. Ilara answered it the same way. They did not use warp drives, she said. They walked. The council processed the word and arrived at metaphor, because metaphor was more comfortable than the alternative. She let them arrive there and then corrected them. No fuel, she said. No time. No limits. The between connected everything to everything else, and humans had learned to use the connection. The council's request for a demonstration was unanimous and immediate, which Ilara had expected. She had given this demonstration before, in smaller rooms with fewer witnesses, and the reaction was consistent across species regardless of how much advanced preparation they had received. She asked for a moment of quiet, not because the walking required it, but because the observers generally benefited from it. She closed her eyes on one side of the observation deck. She took a single step. 3 seconds passed. She stepped out of empty air on the other side of the chamber, the space between her starting position and her current one having been covered by a route that did not pass through the room at all. The silence that followed lasted longer than silences usually last in rooms containing a dozen species with opinions. She explained it in the terms she found most accurate, which were not the terms of engineering or physics as the council understood those disciplines. The between was not a dimension of distance, she said. It was a dimension of connection. Every point in the universe was already in contact with every other point, the way two ends of a single object are already the same object regardless of the space between them. Warp drives treated the universe as a problem to be overcome. Walking treated it as a condition to be understood. The drive forced space to bend. Walking required a mind that had genuinely accepted that there was no meaningful distance to force. The council sat with this. They had spent their entire institutional history building better machines to cross a vastness that a quiet woman from an unremarkable planet had just told them was not there. The galactic community's response organized itself into 3 simultaneous reactions that the council struggled to manage separately and found impossible to manage together. Awe at what the humans had demonstrated, fear of what the humans could do with it, and the specific, urgent greed of civilizations that had spent centuries paying enormous costs for slower travel, and were now being shown that the costs had been unnecessary. The council framed its demand as a request for knowledge sharing in the interests of galactic advancement. Ilara received the framing without comment and declined the substance. There was nothing to surrender, she said. Walking was not a mechanism that could be extracted and installed. It was not a technique that could be documented and distributed. It was a state of perception that had to be arrived at through a process that could not be shortcut, and the process was not something humanity had invented or owned. The threats that followed were the standard progression, sanctions, then blockade, then the implied military option. Ilara let each one settle before responding. She noted, in the same unhurried tone she had used throughout, that they were threatening a species that could be anywhere in the universe in the time required to complete a breath, and she suggested they finish the calculation before committing to a course of action. The spies arrived on Earth some weeks later. They found no laboratories, no training compounds, no secured documents. They found people living their lives. They returned with nothing, and reported the most unsettling detail in their debrief. The humans were not guarding anything. There was no secret to find. The ability, it emerged, required something that could not be taken from someone who had it or given to someone who did not. The debrief's final assessment named it simply humility. Thessa had submitted her research proposal with the expectation that the council would take months to approve it and was on Earth within 3 weeks, which suggested the council wanted answers faster than standard process allowed. She arrived with equipment and methodology and the specific confidence of a scientist who has correctly identified a problem and developed an appropriate framework for solving it. The framework did not survive contact with its subject. She spent 2 weeks looking for the infrastructure she had assumed must exist and found none. The humans she spoke with were helpful and unhurried, and produced no evidence of a training regimen, no ancient texts describing the technique, no institutions dedicated to its preservation or transmission. They gardened. They painted things. They cooked meals that took longer than necessary and seemed to consider this worthwhile. They sat outside in weather that other species would have found uncomfortable and appeared to find it pleasant. Children played in ways that produced no observable outcome. Old people sat in chairs and watched things that were not screens. She found the woman under a tree on a Tuesday morning and asked her question with the directness of someone who had run out of indirect approaches. The woman's answer arrived without hesitation or performance. Thessa was trying too hard, she said. Walking was not about reaching a destination. It was about understanding that you had never left the place you were trying to reach. Then the woman took her hand and stepped forward, and Thessa opened her eyes on a beach on the other side of the planet with waves running over her feet, and the woman gone, and the sky a different color than the sky she had been standing under. She stood there for a long time feeling something she could not immediately name. Then she named it home. Everywhere, simultaneously, and without condition. She took a breath. She took a step. She walked. Thessa had rehearsed the demonstration on the journey back, not because the walking required rehearsal, but because she wanted to be precise about what she said afterward, and precision under the attention of a full council session was different from precision in a quiet conversation. She stood before them and did not build to it. She closed her eyes, thought of her mother's garden with the specificity of someone returning to a place they know by smell and light and the particular quality of wind off a nearby hill, and stepped forward. She came back holding a flower. The stem was still warm from the afternoon sun on a world that was currently several light years away. She placed it on the council table where everyone could see it and let the fact of it do its work. She told them what Thessa before Earth would have found impossible to say with a straight face. The universe was not a collection of separate locations connected by the inconvenient void between them. It was a single continuous fabric, and warp drives were tools for tearing through that fabric, and walking was something else entirely, a matter of finding the threads and moving along them the way anything moves along something it is already part of. The council could not install this understanding in their ships. They could not purchase it from a supplier or extract it from a captured human. They could only arrive at it, and arriving required unlearning distances they had spent their entire institutional history treating as facts. The council sat with the word that kept coming back to them as she spoke: philosophy. It was considerably more dangerous than any engine. The corporations had been the primary financial beneficiaries of 50,000 years of everyone needing warp drives, and they responded to the walking demonstrations with the focused energy of organizations that have identified an existential threat and have resources to deploy against it. The propaganda was professional. Walking was dangerous. The between was unstable. Humans were concealing the true failure rate. The council hearings produced testimony from experts whose funding sources were not disclosed in their credentials. Ilara addressed the council on the third day of hearings and did not respond to the specific claims, because responding to specific claims was a method of legitimizing the framework they were embedded in. She said instead that every sentient being in the galaxy had the same capacity the humans had, because the between connected everything to everything, and therefore everything had access to it. And the corporation's fear was understandable, but it was making them say things that were not true, and the council deserved better than that. The corporations proposed the test, believing it was unanswerable. Andromeda, 2 million light years. Return within a day with evidence. They had done the math on warp travel times, and the math was satisfying. Ilara agreed without consulting anyone, which surprised the room, and named Marcus, which surprised it further. He was a gardener from Kansas who had learned to walk in a field outside his house 6 months earlier, and had not walked further than the next star system. He was nervous in the specific way of someone who has been asked to do something large, and has decided to do it anyway. 3 hours after he stepped into the between, he stepped back out holding a piece of basalt from a planet in the Andromeda galaxy that no ship from the Milky Way had ever reached. He put the rock on the table next to Thessa's flower. The corporations filed for restructuring within the year. Thessa did not apply for the teaching position because no teaching position existed. She created the role by doing it, which was consistent with how walking itself worked, not through institutional approval, but through the simple fact of showing up somewhere and beginning. She traveled to worlds that had requested contact and worlds that had not, and she taught in whatever space was available, which turned out to be gardens and shorelines, and the kind of empty fields that exist at the edge of settlements and belong to no particular purpose. The curriculum, to the extent there was one, was consistently the same three things. The universe was not a collection of separate objects. Being lost was not possible in a fabric you were part of. Control was not the correct relationship to have with the between. Students who accepted these three things and sat with them long enough without demanding that they resolve into something more technical generally found the walking arriving on its own, the way understanding arrives when you stop pushing it. The students who did not learn were predictable in their failure modes. Scientists wanted the equations first. Military personnel wanted to know how to weaponize the approach angle. Politicians wanted to understand what leverage it created. Walking met all of these orientations with the same response, which was nothing, because the between did not accommodate agendas. The humans observed this from a comfortable distance and felt something they recognized as pride without the component that usually accompanied pride, which was the desire to be seen having it. They had found a door in the universe. They had pointed at it. The galaxy was learning to use it on its own terms. The warp drives went into museums with a speed that surprised the historians who later tried to document the transition, because the conventional expectation was that established technologies resist replacement for generations regardless of what replaces them. This expectation assumed that the replacement offered incremental improvement. Walking did not offer incremental improvement over warp travel. It made the concept of improvement in this domain irrelevant, the way the invention of written language made improving oral memory techniques a secondary concern. Within a century, the drives were in the same display cases as the engines and ships that had preceded them, and children on school visits looked at them with the particular expression children have for things that are obviously inefficient and wonder why anyone ever used them. The transformation that mattered more than the practical one was harder to put in a museum. Species that had organized their identities around the distances between themselves and everyone else discovered that the distances were gone, and the identities required revision. Some found this destabilizing. Most found it, gradually, like something they had been waiting for without knowing they were waiting. Walking through the between and arriving somewhere far away did not feel like traveling. It felt like remembering that you had always been connected to the place you arrived at, which was true in the way that things are true when they have always been true, and you have simply not had access to the experience of them. The humans continued doing what they did. They planted things and made things and disagreed about things and sat outside in the evenings. They did not organize a ceremony for what they had given the galaxy or issue a statement about their role in its transformation. They stepped aside in the way that people step aside when they have helped with something, and the thing is now doing well on its own, and their continued presence at the center of it would be about them rather than about the thing. The galaxy noticed this eventually and found it, as it found most things about humanity on reflection, to be the most recognizably human aspect of the whole story. The Cthar had built their empire on the principle that what was outside the border was a threat, and they had applied this principle consistently enough and for long enough that it had become indistinguishable from wisdom to the people raised inside it. When walking emerged as the galaxy's new mode of travel, the Cthar government assessed it with the same framework they applied to everything external and reached the same conclusion they always reached. The border was sealed. The warp drives, which at least had the virtue of being controllable and taxable, were destroyed rather than allowed to become a point of comparison with something the government could not regulate. Humanity was designated a threat to Cthar cultural integrity, and the designation was not wrong in the way the government intended it. Walking did dissolve certain certainties, and the Cthar government had built its authority on those certainties. For 50 years, the galaxy left them alone, which was the correct response, and also the only available one. The child who slipped past the border patrols was 7 years old, and had grown up on stories that were technically illegal to tell, which meant they circulated with the particular energy that illegal stories always have among children. She found the old woman in a garden on the nearest human world, and the old woman looked at her the way people look at things they have been expecting. Alara did not explain anything. She took the child's hand and walked. In an hour they visited a dozen worlds. The child stood on ice and in forest and in the ruins of something ancient and felt, in each place, the same thing. She belonged there. She belonged everywhere. She came home with the feeling still in her chest and told no one, and the next morning she took a step, and it worked. Soria did not intend to start a movement. She shared what she had because she was 7 years old and had just experienced something extraordinary, and the natural response to an extraordinary experience at 7 is to find the nearest friend and describe it in detail. Her friend learned to walk within a week. That friend told 2 others. The network that formed over the following years was not organized in any way the Cthar security apparatus was designed to detect, because it had no meetings, no hierarchy, no communication channel that could be monitored. It existed in the between, where the Empire had no presence and no jurisdiction, and the young Cthar who found their way into it discovered that being somewhere their government could not reach felt not like exile, but like the first breath after a long time in a small room. The security reports described children vanishing from their homes and reappearing without explanation. The government's response was to restrict movement, which had the effect of demonstrating to every child in the Empire that the adults were frightened, which made the stories more compelling rather than less. Soria walked to the Imperial Palace on a night when the Emperor was working late, and she stepped out of empty air in the throne room, and she waited while he processed her presence. "You cannot confine someone who can step through walls," she told him. They were not rebels. They were not making demands. They were awake, she said, and the universe, once woken in a person, did not go back to sleep on request. The Emperor had come to power inheriting a framework and had governed within it with the genuine belief that the framework was protecting something worth protecting. This was true. The Cthar had a language that had developed in isolation into something intricate and musical, an artistic tradition that had taken their particular aesthetic sensibility, somewhere no other culture had arrived at, a set of social practices built around specific geographic features of their home world that had produced a way of being together that was quiet and precise and deeply comfortable to the people raised in it. These were real things. The Emperor was not wrong that they could be lost. He was wrong about what threatened them. He asked his question, and Soria let it settle before answering, because it deserved that. She told him that Cthar identity was not stored in the borders. It was stored in the language and the art and the memory, and the specific way Cthar people moved through rooms and told stories and prepared food. Walking would not touch any of that. Walking would add to it, the way any new experience adds to a person without replacing what was there before. She told him fear was a wall, and walls were the kind of thing that felt permanent only until you stopped believing in them. The Emperor turned to the window and looked at the stars for a long time. Soria watched him see them differently. He turned back and asked her to teach him. The Cthar borders opened the following month, not through any diplomatic process, not through treaty or negotiation, but through the quiet accumulation of footsteps crossing boundaries that had stopped being real. The transformation moved at the speed of generations, which is the speed that genuine change moves when it is going to last. The older Cthar found walking difficult in the way that any perceptual shift is difficult for a mind that has organized itself around a different set of assumptions for decades. Some never managed it, and this was not a failure. They had their language and their art and their memories, and the young people who could now step across the galaxy came home with stories that added to all of those things rather than replacing them. The Cthar who grew up after the opening walked to human worlds and Veth worlds and worlds that appeared on no chart they had ever studied, and they returned Cthar, which surprised some of them and should not have surprised any of them. Soria taught for the rest of her life without a curriculum, in the same gardens and fields where Thessa had taught, passing forward the only lesson that had ever mattered, which was that the student already knew how to walk and needed only to stop arguing with themselves about whether it was possible. She walked to Earth on an evening when the light was doing something particular through the trees, and found Alara in the garden, very old, watching the flowers close for the night. Soria sat beside her and said thank you for the specific thing that deserved thanks, which was not walking but the universe being shown to her as something other than empty. Alara took her hand and said that was all they had ever done. Help people open their eyes. The stars came out above the garden, and neither of them spoke, and neither of them needed to. 1,000 years produced changes that a century could only suggest. The galaxy that walking had made was not recognizable as the same place that had debated banning it in a council chamber, while warp drive corporations testified about instability in the between. Trade had dissolved first, because the economic logic of trade depended on the friction of distance, and distance was gone. Money had followed, because money was a technology for moving value across space and time, and both of those axes had been flattened. Borders had become the kind of thing that existed in historical documents and nowhere else. Wars had become a theoretical exercise, something philosophers discussed in the same register they discussed other logical impossibilities. You could describe the conditions under which one might occur, but the conditions required a geography of separation that the between had made unavailable. The species that declined to walk were not punished. They were not pressured. They continued in their chosen arrangements, and the galaxy moved around them the way a river moves around a stone. And eventually the stone becomes a feature of the river rather than an obstacle to it. The humans remained in the middle of all of this in the way that water is in the middle of a river, present and essential, and not particularly visible as a distinct element. They lived on 1,000 worlds and behaved on each of them the way they had always behaved. Kale asked the elder the question that young people in comfortable times always ask about the decision that made the comfort possible. The elder said that walking was about connection, and that connection by definition could not belong to one person. You could not be connected alone. The answer had the quality of something obvious that was also entirely true. The between was not dangerous in the way that the warp drive corporations had claimed in their testimony, but it was not without its own challenge. And the challenge was one that machines could not have produced because machines did not have the capacity to be overwhelmed by meaning. The dimension of connection showed whoever entered it the actual state of the universe, everything touching everything, every moment of every existence threaded into every other, the full weight of relationship made perceptible rather than merely theoretical. Most minds encountered this and stepped back out into ordinary space with a sense of expansion that took days to settle. Some minds encountered it and could not find their way back to the premise that there was somewhere separate to return to. The unmoored had stopped being lost in a spatial sense. They were lost in the sense of having forgotten that they were a particular person in a particular place with particular people who were waiting. Mira understood this distinction because she had felt the edge of it herself and had found her way back by thinking of specific things: the smell of her grandmother's kitchen, the sound of a friend's laugh, the weight of a specific book she had read 3 times. She went into the between looking for people who had lost access to their specific things, and she sat with them and provided the specific things from outside until the things worked again. Memory, she told the people who asked how she did it, was stronger than distance. In the between, this was not a metaphor. Mira worked for decades before she understood the pattern well enough to explain it to someone else, and then she spent another decade finding the right people to explain it to. The unmoored were not a uniform category. Each one had become lost in their own particular way, following their own particular thread of the between's infinite connections until the thread was all they could see, and the life they had come from had become abstract and then invisible. The intervention was therefore also not uniform. What worked was presence and specificity, sitting with the lost person in the between, where Mira had learned to remain for extended periods without losing herself, and introducing specific true things about who the person was until one of the specific true things caught. The network of helpers she assembled was self-selecting in the best way, because the work required a temperament that excluded most of the reasons people usually seek authority or recognition. The rememberers had neither. They had a name and a practice, and a shared understanding of what they were doing, which was the minimum necessary infrastructure for the work. They watched for the signs Mira had catalogued: walkers who lingered, who seemed present in body but absent in the particular way that meant they were spending more time in the between than out of it. They introduced themselves. They asked questions. They held hands when hands were offered. The galaxy recognized them as essential with the slow certainty of a place recognizing what it needs, and this recognition came without ceremony, which was appropriate, because patience does not require ceremony to be enough. Thessa had grown up in a galaxy so thoroughly transformed by walking that the world her ancestor had left to join the first council session was as remote to her imagination as the warp drive era was to the people who had lived through the transition. She knew about weapons from the same sources she knew about steam engines, historical archives and museum displays, and the particular tone adults used when describing things that were over. Famine had ended when distance ended, because hunger in one place and food in another place had been a transportation problem, and transportation was no longer a problem. The between was full of light, which was not a description she had received from any teacher, but was simply what she found when she walked into it. Not physical light exactly, but the quality of light, the sense of things being visible that had previously been dark. Senna had been in the between for 50 years, which in the between's experience of time meant very little, and in the experience of the people who had known Senna meant everything. Thessa found her sitting in the luminous fabric of the dimension's connection light, looking at something only she could see. Thessa sat beside her and did not try to explain anything. She introduced herself. She said she was there to remind. She found the name of Senna's daughter in the archive, and she said it, and she watched the name do what names do when they reach the person they belong to. Senna's eyes came back from wherever they had been. They walked home together, and Thessa understood what Mira had spent decades trying to put into words. In a dimension where everything was connected to everything, the most powerful thing was still one specific person holding one specific hand. The generation that grew up not knowing warp drives grew into adults who could not explain to their grandparents what it had felt like to need them, and their children could not explain it either, because the children had nothing to compare the between to. Walking was simply how you moved, the way breathing was simply how you lived. A child in the morning could visit the ice shelf of one world, the forest canopy of another, the salt flats of a third, and be home for the evening meal, and none of this would be remarkable to the child or to anyone who knew her. The galaxy had become the kind of place you could live in entirely, rather than visiting small pieces of while the rest remained out of reach. The whispers began quietly enough that the first walkers to notice them mentioned it to others rather than to any official body, because it did not feel like a discovery that required a committee. It felt like something you told a friend. A sense, present in the between but pointing beyond it, of a layer below the layer, a depth beneath the connection. Something vast attending to them from a direction that had no name. Elias addressed the assembly when the conversations had accumulated enough that an assembly response seemed appropriate. He said that walking had begun with the discovery that separation was an illusion, and perhaps what was happening now was the discovery that reality itself had more levels than the one they were living in. He said humans were curious by definition and could not stop walking by nature, and so the deep would be explored, not because anyone had decided to be brave, but because that was simply what they were. Sora spent 12 years studying the whispers before she was willing to propose an expedition, because she wanted to understand what she was proposing to walk toward before she asked anyone to follow her. The understanding she arrived at was incomplete, and she said so to the team she assembled, which was one of the reasons they trusted her. She believed the deep was not a location in the way that a planet was a location, or even in the way that the between was a location. It was a perspective, a vantage point from which the physical universe appeared as one layer of something with more layers, the way a single page is one layer of a book. They stepped together, which mattered in a way that Sora did not fully understand until they were already going. The between received them the way it always did, and then they stepped further, and further meant something different here than it did in ordinary walking. It meant inward rather than across. Layer by layer the familiar sense of the between gave way to something older and stiller, and the walkers felt the universe they had come from becoming small in the way that your hometown becomes small from sufficient altitude, not diminished but contained, a specific place inside a larger context. The galaxies were visible as patterns. The universes were visible as bubbles drifting in something that had no walls. Everything they had ever known was sound inside a larger sound. Sora reached toward the larger sound and found that it reached back. Not a being exactly, a presence, patient and vast and oriented toward them with an attention that felt like nothing so much as relief. Then the whisper arrived, not in words, not in any transmission the between normally carried, but directly and unmistakably. Welcome. It had been waiting a long time to say it. The stories Sora brought back required a different kind of listening than the galaxy was accustomed to. They were not about places or events. They were about what it felt like to encounter something that had been present for longer than any physical structure in the universe had existed, and had spent all of that time doing one thing, which was paying attention. The Watchers had watched galaxies assemble from gas and collapse into themselves and reassemble. They had watched stars complete their full arc from ignition to cinder. They had watched species emerge from chemistry, develop awareness, build civilizations, make choices, sometimes survive those choices, and sometimes not. They had watched all of this with the complete attention of beings for whom attention was the only capacity remaining, and they had watched it alone, which was the detail that Sora returned to most often when she described the encounter. She had asked them directly, in the way that the between allowed feeling to function as language, why they had waited for visitors rather than signaling their presence. Their response was not an explanation but an experience. She felt what they had felt for so long, which was the impossibility of signaling across the gap between pure perception and physical existence. They had no hands to wave. They had been watching the galaxy learn to walk and had hoped, without being able to communicate the hope, that walking far enough would eventually bring someone to where they were. The galaxy received this and wept in the way that populations weep when something they did not know they were carrying is named and can finally be set down. They had been witnessed the entire time. The darkness between stars had never been empty. The taxonomy of cosmic hierarchy that the galaxy had always assumed placed the oldest and most evolved at the top, looking down, possessing capabilities and knowledge that younger species spent their development trying to approach. The Watchers did not fit this model. They were old beyond any useful measurement, and they had transcended every physical limitation that younger species struggled against, and they watched the walkers with an expression, or what Sora had interpreted as the emotional equivalent of an expression, that was not superior. It was longing. They had evolved so far past play that they could no longer remember what it felt like from the inside, and they watched the galaxy playing with the wistful attention of someone watching children do something they can no longer do themselves. The visits became regular, not expeditions now, but the kind of thing you did because you wanted to rather than because discovery required it. Walkers from every species stepped into the deep and sat with the Watchers the way you sit with elderly relatives who cannot speak easily, but whose presence means something that cannot be replaced by absence. The walkers brought feelings the way you bring something from home, specific memories, moments of beauty, things that had happened that week. The Watchers received these and returned gratitude in quantities that were difficult to process. A child asked her mother the question that children ask when they want to understand why adults do things that have no obvious practical purpose. The mother said that everyone deserved to be seen, regardless of what form they took or how long they had existed, and that the Watchers were the galaxy's oldest relatives, and you visit your relatives because they are family. The child sat with this and found that it resolved all her questions simultaneously. Walking was not about going somewhere. It was about finding the places where you already belonged and returning to them, which meant it had always been about coming home. 10,000 years produced something that none of the beings present at the first council demonstration could have named as a goal, because it was not a goal so much as what goals look like when they have been achieved long enough that the achieving is no longer visible. The galaxy was a garden. Not metaphorically, walkers moved between worlds with the specific attentiveness of people who understood that caring for something and owning something were entirely different relationships, and they had chosen caring. Damaged ecosystems received attention. Invasive patterns were redirected. Seeds from one world found soil on another, and the other world was better for it. Nobody governed this. Nobody organized it. It was simply what walkers did when they had nowhere particular to be and noticed something that needed tending. The Watchers in the deep had learned to share memories across the gap, not language, but experience, the way a feeling shares itself when someone finally has the ability to receive it. They showed the walkers things that had no other witnesses. The formation of the first stars, the long, slow cooling of galaxies that had burned themselves out before the current ones formed, the texture of time in the era before matter had organized itself into anything with a surface. The walkers returned with these, and the galaxy made of them what all communities make of things too large to hold individually. A young Veth asked the human elder what her species had done that mattered most. The elder thought for a long time before answering. "We taught the galaxy to walk," she said. "Not between stars, between loneliness and connection. That was the distance that needed closing. That was the one that had always mattered." The words traveled in the way that true things travel when the ground is ready for them, not through broadcast or publication, but through the between itself, passed from walker to walker until they were present everywhere simultaneously, which was appropriate given what they said. Connection is the only distance that matters. Children heard them before they could read. Elders recognized in them something they had always known without having the words for it. The phrase became the center of the walker teaching, not because anyone decided to make it central, but because it kept arriving at the center on its own. Lyra walked to the edge because she needed to know if the teaching held at the extremity. The between grew thin at the universe's edge in the way that fabric grows thin at a frayed hem, and the sensation of walking through it was different from the confident movement through the galaxy's center, more careful, more attentive, like walking on ground that has not been walked before. She found the Watcher there in the way you find something that has been in a place so long it has become part of the quality of the air. She sat, She did not attempt communication because communication required two parties capable of the same kind of sending, and this watcher was beyond the kind that had learned to share feelings with the regular visitors. She simply contributed her presence to the place, which was what sitting with someone always means at its most essential. She sat for what her body registered as years, and the between registered as nothing, and eventually the watcher found a way to reach her, and what it sent was not complex. It was the relief of a single feeling arriving after an absence, so long the feeling had been forgotten. "Thank you," it said without words, for coming. Lyra took what it had no hand to offer and held it. "None of us are alone anymore," she said. "That is the only promise we make. And it is the only one that matters." The return was difficult in the specific way that returns are difficult when you have been somewhere that recalibrates you, and the place you return to has not recalibrated with you. Colors arrived at Lyra's eyes with an insistence she had not experienced since childhood. Sounds had edges that required adjustment. Walkers always adjusted, which was something the teachers said and which turned out to be true, and Lyra adjusted over weeks, and then was simply back, changed in the ways that extended time, in the deep changed everyone and functional in all the ways that mattered. She told the story to everyone who would sit for it. She told it in gardens and at beach fronts and in the quiet fields that walkers use for exactly this kind of telling. She said the walkers were the ones who closed distances, and that this description extended further than stars and species and the living and the watchers. It extended to the edge of everything, where the oldest being in the universe had been waiting in a silence that had finally been answered. The anniversary gathering was quiet, because that was the right scale for it. Walkers came to their local gardens and beaches and fields, and held hands, and closed their eyes, and stepped together into the between, and walked to where the watchers were, and sat with them in the full silence of a connection that needed nothing added to it. On Earth, in a garden that had been tended by volunteers for 10,000 years, a flower bloomed that had been planted by the first human who ever walked. It was still growing. It had always been growing. In its own unhurried way, it had never stopped. The story does not end because walking does not end, and the between that carries every footprint of every walker who has ever moved through it has been filling for 10,000 years, and will continue filling for whatever comes after 10,000 years. Each step a presence added to the presence of all the steps before it. The whole accumulation a kind of memory that the between holds the way deep water holds the temperature of seasons long past. The humans whose names open this story are not remembered by name. This is not a loss. Their footprints are in the between, which is a more permanent record than any name, and every walker who has ever moved through the between has moved through the space their steps made familiar. A child takes her first walk on an ordinary morning, when the light through the garden is the particular quality of light that has always made people want to go somewhere. She steps into the between and finds it full of the felt presence of everyone who has been here before her, which is everyone who has ever walked, which is everyone she knows and many more she has never met. She is not afraid. She has arrived somewhere she recognizes without having been there. Her mother waits on the other side and asks where she went. The child thinks about it. Everywhere and nowhere and here, she says. It is all the same place. Her mother takes her hand, and they walk together to the garden where the oldest flower is still blooming, and they sit beside it and watch the stars, and the stars, across a distance that has always been nothing, watch back. The humans had simply been the first to see it clearly. That was all. That was everything.